I want to tell you about the man who came to Ward 6 on a Tuesday in November, and what he did there, and why I have never been able to stop thinking about it. My name is Gilda Sorrell. I was a charge nurse at the ALD and MERE Royal Infirmary for 22 years. In that time I saw every kind of visitor, the dutiful ones who came weekly and spent the hour looking at their watches, the ones who cried too loudly in the corridor, the ones who never came at all. You learn to read a ward from its visitor log. You learn what a blank page says about a person's life as clearly as anything written on it. Sergeant Major O'Rien Croft's page had been blank for 4 months. He was 81. He'd come to us in July with a chest infection that had never quite resolved, and which had left him with a tiredness he couldn't shake. He wasn't dying quickly, he was diminishing, the way some men do, slowly and without complaint, as if they had decided that the end was a thing to be endured with the same steadiness they'd brought to everything else. He had no wife. His only son had emigrated years before, and the contact had lapsed, as contact does when enough time and distance accumulate. He had a regimental badge on his bedside table, and a photograph that I had never seen anyone but himself look at. That was the sum of it. I noticed the man at my desk on a Tuesday because he didn't fit. We were not a busy ward, 6 beds, older patients, the low hum of machines and the occasional sound of rain. He was in civilian clothes, a dark coat, plain trousers, no insignia of any kind. He was perhaps 35, upright in the way that some men carry even in ordinary clothes, not stiff, but settled, as if the posture was simply the shape he was. He had asked the junior nurse at the door whether he might check the visitor log for a patient, and she'd let him in because he had the kind of manner that made refusal feel unnecessary. I watched him read it. He turned to the most recent pages. He went back once, then again. His face did not change exactly, but something behind it did. A small, private adjustment, the kind a person makes when they have confirmed something they already suspected and had hoped not to find. He set the book down and looked up, and that was when he saw me watching him. He said his name, Corporal Idris Vane, from the Western Gate, and he said he'd come to visit a regimental friend in the infirmary, a man in the 4th bed, but the man had been discharged that morning, and he'd found that out too late. He'd noticed Sergeant Major Croft's name in the ward register at the door. He said he wasn't certain if the old man would know him. They'd served in different companies, different years, but would I mind if he sat with him for a few minutes since he was here? I said I didn't mind. What else do you say to that? It wasn't protocol, but the visitor log had 4 months of empty pages, and the old man in the end bed was awake and looking at the ceiling. I watched from the doorway. The corporal pulled the chair close, sat down, and said something quiet. I couldn't hear it. The old man turned his head, looked at him for a moment, and then said something back. The corporal nodded. He didn't rush anything. He didn't perform the visit. He simply sat and talked occasionally, and when the old man's eyes grew heavy, he waited until the old man was asleep before he stood. He straightened the blanket, just the edge of it, one small tuck, and then he left. On his way out, he stopped at my desk and asked whether the sergeant major had regular visitors. I said no. He thanked me, said good afternoon, and walked out into the rain. I thought that was the end of it. He came back the following Sunday. This time he was earlier, just after noon. He had a folded newspaper under his arm and a paper bag that turned out to contain 2 slices of fruit cake, one of which he left at the nurse's station with a word of thanks before going in. He stayed for an hour and a quarter. When he left, the old man was sitting up in bed, and there was color in his face that I hadn't seen since July. After that, I made a point of being on shift on Sundays when I could. Over the weeks, I pieced together what passed between them, partly from what I overheard and partly from what Sergeant Major Croft told me in the way that patients sometimes tell the nurse things they wouldn't say to anyone they'd have to see again. The corporal would read to him, sometimes the newspaper, sometimes a book the old man kept under his pillow, a history of the ALD and MERE household regiments that had been published when the old man was young, and that had his name in the acknowledgments, One line, long since unread by anyone. Sometimes they talked about the regiment. The old man had served 40 years, had stood the western gate as a young corporal at the same post where Vane now stood, had marched in 4 Founders' Day processions, had trained young men who had gone on to serve with distinction. He had not been a famous man or even a noticed one. He had simply done his duty, year after year, and then retired, and then his wife had died, and then his son had drifted away, and then his health had gone, and here he was. I remember the morning the corporal noticed the badge on the bedside table. It was the 6th or 7th Sunday. He had picked up the history book to find where they'd left off, and his eye caught the small metal badge propped against the lamp, the cross-rifle insignia of the old household marksmen, a company that had been folded into the main regiment before Vane's time. He picked it up carefully, turned it in his fingers, and looked at the old man. He said something in a low voice. The old man's face changed completely. He sat up straighter than I had seen him sit in months. There was a conversation after that, quick, low, the kind that happens when 2 people find an unexpected patch of shared ground, and I caught only pieces of it. The old man said the company had been stood down long before the corporal would have come up. The corporal said he'd heard the name but never met a man who had served it. The old man said there were very few of them left. He said it matter-of-factly, not sadly, in the way of a man accustomed to being the last one standing in a particular place. I could hear that it mattered to both of them. That was the day the old man showed him the photograph. I had never seen it clearly before. The corporal held it, looked at it for a long time, and said something that made the old man laugh, a real laugh, short and rusty from disuse, but real. He set the photograph back on the table himself, facing out, and I noticed that every Sunday after that it stayed that way, facing the room, not the wall. The weeks moved as weeks do in a ward. Some mornings the old man was weaker than others, and the corporal would stay longer on those Sundays, reading until the old man slept, then sitting quietly in the chair with the book closed in his lap. On the stronger days there was conversation. On the very good days there was a kind of banter, quiet and dry, the old man wry about his condition in the way that only certain soldiers seemed to manage. As if illness were an unreasonable posting they were determined to comport themselves through. In January the old man stopped eating well. He slept more. His breathing changed. I have sat with enough patience at that stage to know the shape of it, and I think the corporal knew too, because he came twice in the week of the 23rd rather than waiting for Sunday, and he stayed each time until visiting hours were over. He was there on the last morning. He had come before dawn as if something had told him to. I don't know how to account for that, but it is what happened. I came on shift at 6 and he was already in the chair, sitting in the same upright posture he always carried, his coat on, the room dark except for the small lamp by the bed. The old man was unconscious by then. The corporal was not reading. He was simply sitting with him, which was, I have come to believe, exactly the right thing. Sergeant Major Orrin Croft died at 7:15 in the morning. Peacefully. The corporal sat for a few minutes afterward, then stood, straightened his coat, and touched the old man's hand once, the back of it briefly, the way you touch something you want to remember, and left without speaking to anyone. I did not see him again for 3 weeks. When I did, it was because he came to return the history book, which the old man had pressed on him sometime in January, and which he had now read cover to cover. He set it on my desk and asked what had happened to the badge and the photograph. I said they'd been placed with the personal effects, which were in the hospital's storage pending any family claim. He asked whether there was family. I said we hadn't been able to locate any. He nodded. He asked, very quietly, whether the sergeant major's name had been submitted to the household controller for the Founders' Day roll call, a right that extended to all retired members of the regiment in good standing. I told him I hadn't known that was possible, and that I doubted anyone else had thought of it. He said he would see to it. I learned afterward, not from him, he never mentioned it, that he had written to the household controller's office, submitted the old man's service record and his years of standing duty, and requested that Sergeant Major Orrin Croft's name be read aloud at the Founders' Day ceremony. The request was granted. The roll call is a small part of the ceremony, a list of names, read by a duty officer into a quiet forecourt. Most of the crowd doesn't know what it is. The names are read plainly, without commentary, one after another, and when they end there is a short silence and then the ceremony moves on. But the name was read. A few of the older men and women in the crowd would have known what it meant: a retired guardsman, one of their own, remembered by the institution he had given himself to for 4 decades. I was told about it by a nurse from another ward who had heard it from someone who had been there. She said the name had meant nothing to her. But she said there had been a man in uniform near the back of the forecourt who had stood very still when it was read, and she had thought perhaps it had meant something to him. On the day of the funeral, a civil service, attended by 2 hospital staff members and 1 person from the regimental association who had seen the notice, the corporal was there in uniform. He had arranged for the badge and the photograph to be released from storage and placed in the coffin. I know this because the funeral director told me afterward. In that particular way, people share details about quiet acts when they are not sure who else will note them. After the service, he came back to the infirmary. He asked to sign the visitor log, the one for Ward 6. He said he wanted to close it properly. I opened it to Sergeant Major Croft's page and handed him the pen, and he signed his name at the bottom, his name, his rank, the date. Then he closed the book, thanked me, and walked out. I went to the window. It was a gray morning, the kind that sits heavily over the city and makes everything look slightly reduced. I watched him cross the courtyard below and turn toward the direction of the palace, a 10-minute walk, the route I had seen him take a dozen times on Sunday evenings. The next day I happened to be near the western gate in the early afternoon. I don't know why I walked that way. Perhaps I wanted to see. He was at his post in full uniform, tall, immaculate, the bearskin and the white gloves and the polished rifle, standing as he always stood, motionless, eyes forward. The tourists were moving past him, the usual river of them with their phones raised. He showed nothing. He was, to any eye in the world, a soldier doing his duty and nothing more. But I had seen him pull a chair to the side of an empty bed on a Tuesday in November. I had seen him tuck the edge of a blanket. I had seen him read aloud from a book that had one man's name in it, one line, long since unread. And I knew that the stillness he carried back to that post was not the same stillness he had set down when he first walked into my ward 4 months before. It was a heavier thing, heavier in the way that something becomes heavy when it has been filled rather than emptied. He never spoke to me about any of it. He never asked for acknowledgement or explanation. He simply saw a blank page in a book and decided that a man's life was worth more than that and acted accordingly. That is the only way I know how to say it. He saw the page was blank, and he signed it.